Well, thank you. Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everybody, depending on where you are. It's a pleasure to be with you. As you said, yeah, this is I'm sort of like fast forwarding us into the future here. We've done the overview, we've done the history, and now I'm kind of moving ahead a few steps. Um, you know, yeah, my remarks are really going to focus on the prospects of if the United States and Iran are able to return to compliance with the JCPOA, what are the prospects for building on that deal? And mostly I'm going to focus on the nuclear angle to this and sort of leave out discussions on regional dynamics or missile issues, which are two other issues the United States would like to talk about. Although, of course, recognizing those are potentially related in some instances, even if those talks occur in separate venues. So sort of I'll start by saying the kind of the obvious, right? I mean, we can all come up with a long list of reasons of why building on the JCPOA would be difficult, right? And to be clear, again, I'm talking in this sense, I'm assuming we go back into the deal for compliance for compliance and then build. I'm not talking about renegotiating a new deal right now. But even so, I think we all recognize why that would be incredibly hard, right? It's not easy, or it's not hard to come up with a list of reasons why. The United States tried to ask for more during JCPOA negotiations and didn't get it, right? So obviously that suggests that maybe, Iran sort of topped out and went as far as it was willing to go in that scenario. And so maybe there's no more room to go. Maybe it's not willing to make any more concessions on the nuclear program. Second, as we all know, the domestic politics in both countries are incredibly complicated when it comes to negotiations and striking a deal. And Iran, right now, and even if the JCPOA can be salvaged, I think it's fair to say, will be very skeptical of U.S. motivations for a follow-on deal moving forward. And arguably, even a deal that just focuses on the nuclear program and sort of, tries to do this sort of longer, stronger type of deal that the United States talks about, that's going to face a lot of criticism domestically in the United States. If other issues aren't tackled as well, such as Iran's support for terrorism and the missile program. And so there's a lot of hurdles, right? And so it's easy to see and easy to say why a JCPOA 2.0 could be difficult, if not impossible. But I think it's worth talking about why such talks may actually be possible, and in very broad terms, what an approach to a JCPOA 2.0 might look like. One overarching reason why it may be possible is because neither Iran nor the United States is completely satisfied with the JCPOA as it is, right? There's things that each side does not like about the deal. And let's start by looking at the United States. If there's one area of bipartisan agreement on Iran right now, it's that the JCPOA alone is insufficient as an agreement between the United States and Iran. It's that it has to be the starting point and not the end point for negotiations. And so that's actually a weird and rare point of consensus within US domestic politics on Iran right now. So there's no shortage of a desire to see those talks get underway. And I would also argue that in broad strokes too, in a generalized sense, there's agreement on the types of things the United States would seek as a follow-on deal, including longer sunset provisions, strengthened monitoring provisions. But right now, a lot of that conversation is really occurring at the surface. It hasn't really gone in depth in a lot of cases to think at a more detailed level. And I think of course, there are key differences over what is realistically achievable, right? I would argue that, and the best approach to do that. The current administration, and I would argue probably a lot of Democrats, want to go back into the JCPOA. They see that as the path towards that bigger, better deal. Whereas, Republicans and critics of the deal think that doing that is just going to cause the United States to lose leverage, and that is never going to be possible, and that deal is never going to be achievable. But of course, these are testable propositions, right? These are things that we can test and that we can know. So I think there's reasons to test those out. Turning to Iran, right? Iran has been clear that the JCPOA only is going to cover nuclear issues, right? It has made this clear time and time again. It's not prepared to discuss missile or regional developments as part of a return to the deal. However, I would argue that if you look at the statements made by Iranian leaders, they've been somewhat inconsistent on whether or not they'd be willing to enter into talks following the revitalization of the JCPOA on these other issues. right in August 2020. And even some of this occurred under the Trump administration. In August 2020, President Rouhani said that further talks with the US might be possible if the US first returns to the JCPOA. On several occasions, Foreign Minister Zarif has also kept the door slightly ajar to talks on regional issues and missile issues, of course, with caveats that these will be, led by the region, not the United States. That these are going to have to include other types of issues on the table, like U.S. military sales to countries in the region, which, of course, I think is we shouldn't be surprised that these are the types of things that Iran is asking for. But of course, these are not decisions that the foreign minister is going to make, that the Iranian president is going to make. These are decisions that the supreme leader will make. But I think more importantly, too, there were a lot of things that Iran was unhappy with under the JCPOA. And that list got a lot longer after the Trump administration withdrew from the deal and reimposed sanctions, unilateral sanctions, and also tried to reorchestrate the snapback provision in the UN Security Council. And so I think, Iranian comments after that, I think we have actually a pretty decent indication of some of the things that Iran would like to fix as part of the JCPOA, and part of what it would probably conclude are its, to borrow a US phrase, the fatal flaws of the deal. These are things, like making it easier for Iran to realize the economic benefits of the deal. Things like, so-called U-turn transactions. Removal of US congressional sanctions, which is something that kind of got papered over for obvious reasons in the JCPOA. Abolishing the snapback provision. And other measures to make sure that a future president cannot do what the Trump administration did. And we have some clear examples of these comments. In February of this year, Foreign Minister Zarif said that any negotiations with the US would have to address the need for a guarantee from Washington that it won't quit the deal again. A number of Iranian officials have raised the need for economic compensation for the US maximum pressure campaign, and there seems to be some agreement that this can be put off into future negotiations, but that seems to be something that Iran might want. And in January of this year, the Supreme Leader's foreign policy advisor, Veliati, said that if any future negotiations occur, Iran's going to want to have a conversation about eliminating the snapback provision. So all of this is to say that there's at least things that each side may want as part of future negotiations, but it is one, at least from the US policy perspective, I think a very big question whether or not the United States should be willing to do any of this. And also, of course, completely unclear whether there's any sort of overlap in US and Iranian interests that can create a JCPOA 2.0. I think that's a really big question. We don't know the answer to that. And of course, and I said I wouldn't touch on regional issues, but when you do expanding, you start looking at some of the regional challenges, and you have other countries that are now sitting down at the table, the menu of potential options and incentives expands, right? Because now you're just not talking about the United States and Iran and other members, other participants of the JCPOA. So that is a new dynamic as well. Of course, it is not surprising, as I said at the outset, and I'm sorry, my camera my screen's a little dark. But it's not surprising that to date, both the United States and Iran have largely focused on what they want, or what they would want out of a follow-on deal, not what they're willing to give. And as we all know, that's really where the crux of the matter is going to fall if talks ever get underway for these discussions. So for that reason, I would argue that any negotiations over a follow-on deal, they're going to need to rethink not only the substance of the deal, but the structure of the deal, the scope of the deal. I think that we're going to need to be potentially the participants of the deal. And so I think we're going to need to be creative on that front. I've sort of informally kicked around 3 potential models or typologies of what a revised or what a new JCPOA could look like. One is sort of what I call the Christmas tree model. And this is the model which I think is dominant in sort of the US conceptual thinking of the way the JCPOA works, and perhaps Iran's too, which is that it's the same basic bargain and it's the same structure, it's the same deal. We just hang some new ornaments on the JCPOA, the tree, where we'll extend the sunsets here, and in exchange we'll give you Iran some additional sanctions relief. And it's kind of the same, it's the same model of the JCPOA, just with a little bit more stuff on it that each side wants. But there's another model to that, and it's rather than hanging ornaments on the tree, we start shearing off some branches of that tree. And you essentially go to something that is perhaps more simplified, isn't a long detailed agreement in the way that the JCPOA is. Maybe it's even a bilateral agreement. but you do things that are a little bit, big for big, so to speak. Maybe it trades things like, a full ban on weapons grade uranium production or reprocessing and plutonium production for removal of snapback and other things like that. And the third model that I would offer is maybe it's a regionalized agreement, right? And this is not a new idea. But there's, and these are not all mutually exclusive in some ways, you can combine them. But the other option is broadening some of the restrictions and the monitoring provisions to the region. And that may be something that's more amenable to Iran and maybe something that's more useful for the United States in the long run. We talked a little bit ago about the risks of follow-on proliferation as a result of Iran's nuclear program. So those are just three sort of like, kind of off the cuff ideas, off the cuff models to throw out there for discussion and debate. But the bottom line is I think we'll need to be creative. One other, I think, sort of two other, I guess, final points that I would make on this before sort of yielding the floor here. One is I think there's a major question looming over this issue of JCPOA 2.0, which is the views of other JCPOA participants on this. I think we kind of know the feelings of the E3 on appetite for another sort of broader deal, their views on the missile threat and Iran's support for terrorism. But to me, at least, and maybe some of our colleagues on here can help shed some light on this, and maybe it's just because I haven't looked at it in too much depth, but the views of Russia and China are a little bit more or less clear to me. So that's a question that would hang over all of this. And finally, I guess I'll say that the final point that I'll make as we approach the June Board of Governors meeting with the IAEA, one thing that I think would have happened regardless of whether or not the United States stayed in the JCPOA is, and I think has, one thing that is, I think, again, what would have happened regardless, and has happened since the JCPOA was finalized, is that this the outing of additional information about Iran's former nuclear weapons program, right? And so I think it's worth noting that any future negotiation is going to have to contend with these ongoing questions into potentially undeclared activities and materials within Iran. And so we can talk about, you can like that, you can not like it, and we can have conversations about what that means. But I think it's important for all sides, whether or not you view that issue as incredibly important or whether you don't. I think it's important for all sides and participants in the deal to think about this question, which is what are the long-term prospects of the survivability of a nuclear deal with Iran if the agency, the IAEA, is unable to resolve concerns about potentially undeclared activities and materials in Iran. I think that poses a real long-term challenge for the survivability of a deal. And I know Andre, I think, is going to touch on at least the question of making the deal more sort of survivable over time. So maybe you'll have thoughts on that as well, Andre. So with that, I will, with those questions, with those sort of ideas to throw out to the group for further thought, I'll end it there. Thank you.